Well, open your Bibles tonight to Daniel chapter 8, as you know. Daniel chapter 8, and tonight we're going to be looking at the second half of verse 23. And if you remember, here in Daniel chapter 8, this chapter centers around three characters, or three historical figures, though one of them is still in the future. And that is Alexander the Great, Antiochus the Fourth, and the coming Antichrist. And so what we're looking at right now is the second half of this chapter, verses 15 through 27. And particularly what we're zoned in on here is verses 23 through 26. And so in the second half of this chapter, if you remember, what is happening is the angel Gabriel is interpreting the vision that God gave to Daniel there in the first 14 verses. And so tonight we're going to pick up where we've left off the last time, and we've been for a few weeks here in verse 23. And so in verses 23 through 26, what we have is the interpretation from the interpretation from Gabriel to Daniel of verses 9 through 14. Okay? So that part of the vision, verses 9 through 14, is now being interpreted by Gabriel here in verses 23 through 26. And I've already shared that, and I'm kind of just reviewing right now to get us up to where we're at so that we can have some context for this. And so here in these verses, what they describe is the character and the conduct of Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus the Fourth, who, if you remember, was the 8th king of the Seleucid Empire, who did great harm to the city of Jerusalem, the temple of God, the people of God, and the law of God. And so what we're looking at here is the character and the conduct of Antiochus the Fourth. But these same words in verses 23 through 26 also describe the character and conduct of the coming Antichrist, which means that these verses have both a near and a far fulfillment. They have a dual fulfillment. Okay? So, as I've shared this already with you, but I'm going to say it again. One commentator put it this way: while verses 1 through 22 have to do with history, yet the man of whom they speak were shadows of the coming man of sin, who is more fully described in the closing verses of the chapter. And so if you notice, in verse 17, just look at verse 17. This is Gabriel speaking to Daniel. It says, "So he came near to where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said to me, 'Understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end.'" Do you see that? So this vision doesn't only refer to events to come in the near future. And what I mean by near future is Daniel is having this vision around 550 BC. Antiochus the Fourth will come into power in 175 BC. So there's the difference. There's, what are we looking at there? 400 years almost between the two. So this vision doesn't just refer to that near fulfillment, that fulfillment in Antiochus IV in 175 to 164 AD or BC, but it also refers, as he says here, to the time of the end. Speaking of the last days, the end times. If you would come down to verse 19, it says, "And he said, Look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the," notice, "latter time of the indignation. For at the appointed time, the end shall be." Again, he's speaking of the last days or the end times. The latter time of the indignation, that is a term to refer to the Great Tribulation period. Okay? And so as we come down now to verse 23, it says, and in the latter time of their kingdom. Now, in a sense, or in the sense of the near fulfillment, the words there, their kingdom, refers to the kingdoms of those four generals that inherited Alexander the Great's empire or his kingdom after his death. If you remember, when he died, his four generals split up his kingdom and each took a section of it. So when it says in the latter time of their kingdom, in the near fulfillment, it's speaking of those empires. Okay? It's speaking of those kingdoms, of those four generals that inherited Alexander the Great's kingdom after his death. Now, Antiochus IV arose out of one of those kingdoms, out of one of those empires, one of those dynasties called the Seleucid dynasty, which had its main territory and capital in Syria. But that kingdom controlled the land of Israel and what people today would refer to as the Levant, that part of the Near East. Okay? So Antiochus IV was the 8th king in that empire and became king in 175 BC. We've already studied all this. Okay? So, Antiochus IV arose to power during the latter portion of those kingdoms, when they were just about on their way out. Okay? So that's why it says, and in the latter time of their kingdom. That's the near fulfillment. All right? But in the sense of far fulfillment, future fulfillment, how this is going to be fulfilled in the coming future is that the words their kingdom here refers to all the Gentile kingdoms which will have their end in the last days, in the latter time, with the coming of the kingdom of Christ. That's when they will end. The kingdoms of men, the kingdoms of the Gentiles ruling over the world will end when Jesus Christ returns to the earth to set up his kingdom. Okay? And so, this is exactly what both the dream of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2 and the vision of Daniel in chapter 7 was all about. If you remember, Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2 and Daniel's vision here in chapter 7 is literally the same dream, it's the same vision, except it's just given to us in two different illustrations. Nebuchadnezzar, when he saw the Gentile kingdoms that would come, he saw a large statue of a man made of metal. That's how he saw it. That's how God showed it to him. And he did because that's the way man sees himself. But God showed Daniel the same revelation, the same thing, but with a different illustration. God showed Daniel the way he sees the kingdoms of men, the way he sees men ruling over men, and that's like animals. They're beasts. And that's why when God shows Daniel the kingdoms that are now and are to come, he explains them by using beasts or animals. Okay? And we've covered all that. So now, here in verse 23, it says, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king will arise. Now, you guys should know this very well because we spent, 2 or 3 weeks at least, right? 3 weeks, I think it was, speaking about this. In the sense of the near fulfillment, these words here, when the transgressors have reached their fullness and a king shall rise, in the sense of the near fulfillment, the king here is Antiochus IV or Antiochus IV. The Jewish people were at a place where they had apostatized against the Lord. And in their sin, when it had reached a certain level, reached a fullness, God raised up this king to bring judgment to his own people. Okay? Now those words, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, not only speak of an apostate Jewish population there in Jerusalem and Judah, but it also speaks of whenever these four kingdoms and the kings that rule over those kingdoms, whenever their sins or their iniquities have reached their fullness, so their transgressions have reached their fullness, God finally brought those kingdoms to an end. And how did he do it? Well, he did it by raising up the Romans. Okay? So when it says, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, who's it speaking about? Well, some Bible scholars will focus on the fact it speaks of the Jewish people and their apostasy against God. Some say it's referring to the kings of these kingdoms. And which one's right? Well, they're both right. Okay? So in the sense of the near fulfillment, the king that's being spoken of here, a king shall arise, is Antiochus IV. But in the sense of a far fulfillment, the king here being spoken of is the Antichrist. The Antichrist. And how do we know that? Well, we know that because when we see from history, when we read the scriptures and we read the book of Daniel, and then we look at history, we see the very things that Antiochus IV did to God, to God's people, to Jerusalem, to the temple, all of that, to his law, all of that, the Bible tells us the Antichrist is going to do in the future. So we can tell by looking at biblical history, secular history, and then reading the prophecies that are to yet be fulfilled, we can see that there's a dual fulfillment here. And how do we know? Well, for instance, it was Antiochus IV who committed what is called the abomination of desolation. And we're told that here in the book of Daniel, that he did that. He made the temple desolate by setting up an image of the Greek god Zeus and demanding the Jews to worship Zeus instead of Yahweh. And he offered and sacrificed a pig on their altar of sacrifice to desecrate the holy place. Antiochus IV did commit the abomination of desolation. So because of that, some Bible scholars will say, well, the abomination of desolation has already been fulfilled. But what happens when we read the New Testament? Jesus in Matthew 24 speaks of the abomination of desolation that was written and spoken of by the prophet Daniel, and he speaks of it as yet future. It's something yet to come. Okay? And it didn't happen in the last temple, so it's going to happen in the next temple that will be rebuilt. Okay? So we know there's a dual fulfillment here whenever we look in the New Testament and see the prophecies about it. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, we've looked at it. Paul prophesies of the abomination of desolation when he says the Antichrist, that man of sin, that man of perdition, what will he do? He will come into the temple of God, set himself up as God, and demand to be worshiped as God. That's the abomination of desolation. So we know this is still yet future. So you know what that means? That means the description, or should I say the interpretation, we're about to read in verses 23 through 25. The interpretation we have here is an interpretation that concerns Antiochus IV and the Antichrist. Okay? So let's just do this real quick. Let's just read it all. Okay? And then here's what we're going to do. Tonight, we're going to look at verse 23, and we're going to finish it. Then what we're going to do, next week, we're going to look at verse 24, and maybe some of 25, and then the next week after that, what we will do then is we will finish this. So we're going to take 3 Wednesday nights to go through this description of the Antichrist. Okay? So if you would, look at verse 23. When the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise. And it says, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully. and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. Through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and he shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means. So what's amazing here is when you read this interpretation of the verses concerning the little horn, okay, in the verses previous in Daniel's vision, these verses are describing and interpreting for us what Antiochus IV is going to be like and what he's going to do. Here's his character, here's his conduct. That's what that's describing. Now, I'm not going to go through it line by line and make the connections between Antiochus and what we have here, because in past studies, I've already given you a lot of information, especially from the book of Maccabees, about what Antiochus did, that this is actually a description of, okay? What I want to focus our time on and what I want to get to, because of the fact that that's all past, okay, this was all fulfilled by 164 BC, I want to get to the future fulfillment of it. Because really, that is what more concerns us living in these days we live in, is it's giving us a description of the coming Antichrist, okay? So with that as an introduction, with that as a review to get us to where we need to be, you'll understand why we're doing what we're doing here. So, in verse 23, when the transgressors have reached their fullness. Now, if we're talking about future fulfillment, what's that describing? When it says, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, it's describing the apostasy of the last days. That whenever the Antichrist rises up as a king and as a ruler in the future, it's giving us the condition of the world at that time. It's going to be a very sinful time. It's going to be a time of apostasy. It's going to be a time of lawlessness. It's going to be a time where man has went off the rails into sin. And if you remember, we spent the last couple weeks looking at that. I took you to the New Testament and showed you several scriptures where Paul and Peter says, in the last days, here's what people will be like. Remember that? Especially when Paul spoke to Timothy and gave him, if you remember, 18 different characteristics of what the general public is going to be like during the last days. And we went through that and we looked at that. That is what is meant here when it says, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, when apostasy and sin in a society and in the world globally is at its worst ever in history. You know what's going to happen in the midst of all that? It's going to pave the way for a king to arise. And when that king arises, he's going to appear to be a man of peace, to be a man who has a plan, to be a man who can take care of all the world's problems. And people are going to think that he's the Messiah, when he's really a false Messiah, promising false peace. Okay? So, the king shall arise here in the last days, out of a society and a culture that will be global, that will be decadent, that will absolutely be so sinful that we've never seen the likes of it in human history yet. What will happen out of that is a king will arise. And look what it says here. A king will arise. Now it gives us the description. Here in verses 23 through 25, we have a description of the Antichrist. Now let me tell you, there are a lot there is a lot of information in both the Old Testament and the New Testament about the Antichrist. One Bible scholar estimated that there are over 100 passages of Scripture that either describe or speak of the character and conduct of the Antichrist. Okay? In Daniel chapter 8, here is one of those quintessential passages. When anybody would ask you, with this Antichrist to come, if it's really true, what's he going to be like? One of the places you should take him is Daniel chapter 8 in these verses, because we have a lot of information here about him. Okay? So notice in verse 23, it says that the first thing will happen. Now, before I get to that, let me say this. Antiochus the Fourth, okay, yeah, because I want to talk about this for a moment. When it says a king shall arise, well, where's he going to arise from? Well, Antiochus the Fourth arose from the Grecian Empire of Alexander the Great. We've talked about that, right? Well, the Antichrist is going to arise, as we have already learned, out of a revived Roman Empire. Okay? So most likely he will be European. Okay? He's going to rise out of the revived Roman Empire. Though the Roman Empire is no longer a world domination as it once was, Europe has been, since the last century, been uniting into the European Union and making efforts to become one by practically erasing their borders and having a common monetary system, the euro, and they've made efforts to unite. And when we see that, that really should catch our attention because of what we read in Scripture. And so, where we get this from, and one of the places where we can understand this, is from here in the book of Daniel, chapter 7. And we've already looked at it, but I want you to turn back to Daniel chapter 7 for a moment. And I was actually wrong earlier. Daniel chapter 7 is the vision that God gave to Daniel about the Gentile kingdoms being like animals. Here in chapter 8, I'm sorry. Here in chapter 8, we see the same thing, but it's God gave Daniel the vision concerning concerning Greece defeating Persia. That's what it was about. But it was still given to us in the way of animals, beasts, right? We had the ram and the goat. The ram was a picture of Persia, and then the goat was a picture of Greece. So I'm sorry, I got that mixed up. So chapter 7 was the vision that God gave to Daniel. This is just like Nebuchadnezzar's dream, okay, of the Gentile kingdoms to come in the form of animals or beasts, all right? The vision Daniel has here in chapter 8 was concerning what was going to happen from his time on until the Antichrist. So what we're looking at there is specifically the Persians defeating the Babylonians, but the Greeks defeating the Persians, and then from there we go on to the future, to the Antichrist. So I just want to make that clear. So Daniel chapter 7 now, in verse 7, Daniel's having the vision that God has given to him concerning the Gentile kingdoms, and it says, after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast. You see that? A fourth beast or animal. And it says, dreadful and terrible and exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. And then it says it was different from all the beasts who were before it. Do you see that? Now, as we've already studied this chapter, we know whenever we look at the vision and we study it and we see the interpretation of it, and then we look at history, we know this is the Roman Empire. Okay? Because the first beast that's in this chapter is Babylon, the second one is Persia, the third one is Greece, and then this fourth one is the kingdom that finally did away with the Grecian Empire, which was the Romans. Okay? So what we're talking about here in verse 7, this is a vision, again, the Lord's giving to Daniel concerning the Roman Empire. But notice what it says at the end of verse 7. That this empire was different than all the others because it was stronger than all the others. It had a geographical area larger than any other. But also, this is a kingdom that is going to make a resurgence in the last days. And how do we know? Because it tells us here that this kingdom, it had 10 horns. You see that? 10 horns. And then Daniel says, as I was considering the horns, Daniel's like trying to figure this out. It says, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. So you have 10 horns, and then the little horn coming up, which is 11. But then that little horn plucks up 3 of the first horns. What are we talking about horns here? In the Bible, horns represent authority and power. Here, they're representing nations. And in this case, 10 particular nations that in the future will arise up out of the area of Europe, out of the area of the seat of the old Roman Empire. Okay? And so he says here, and there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth spouting pompous words. So who is the little horn? The little horn is this king that's going to arise in the future out of the revived Roman Empire. And when you begin then to look at the description, the first description we have of him is he has eyes like the eyes of a man. We're talking about a man here, and a mouth speaking pompous words. Well, if you remember, when we were back in Daniel chapter 7, I took you to the New Testament to show you who this is. This is the beast of the New Testament. Who's that? It's the Antichrist. Okay? So come down with me to verse 19 now. Verse 19, Daniel says, then I wished to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet. Okay, so this again is a very powerful empire, like the world's never seen it up to this point. But what's it say in verse 20? And the 10 horns were on its head, and the other horn. Now, what do we have here? We have an interpretation of verses 7 and 8. We have it rehashed again. The 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, that's the little horn that came up out of the 10, that's the Antichrist, before which the 3 fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. There's another description now of the Antichrist. He's going to speak pompous words or great words. He's going to be a man of great oratory, and we'll see that as we look at chapter 8 even more. So he's going to be very persuasive, but he's also going to speak against the God of the Bible, the true God, the God of Israel. His words, in fact, the New Testament tells us, the book of Revelation tells us that he will blaspheme God. Okay? And so that's the kind of words that it's speaking of here. And so, come down with me to verse 23 now. In verse 23, we have the interpretation of all this. It says, thus he said, The fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it and break it in pieces. And so it's talking about the Roman Empire will rise up, and it will cover a geographical area that at that time was the whole known world. Okay? It will conquer a geographical area larger than any kingdom before it. And so in the mind of the ancients, Rome ruled the world. They ruled the known world, the world known to them. Okay? And so what's interesting is this whole idea about these 10 horns and this one little horn coming up, this is the vision God is giving Daniel, and he's giving him the vision as if this kingdom is a beast, it's an animal, right? Well, if you remember back in Nebuchadnezzar's vision, when he saw the Roman Empire, how did he see it? He saw it as legs of iron, the legs of the statue of the man made of metal. He saw the Roman Empire as the legs of a man, very, very made of iron, very, very strong. But there was a problem. As we all do, naturally, right? We have legs, then we have feet. Okay? And the Bible tells us in Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2 that those feet were mixed. They were made of iron and clay, which means they weren't the most solid. It was a strong kingdom, but it was weak. It was fragile. And on those 2 feet, what do you have? Toes, right? And you have 2 feet, you got 10 toes. And so that's the inference back in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, is the revived Roman Empire of the end times is given to us in the image of 10 toes that are on feet that are mixed with iron and clay, which means, yeah, part of it's strong, but there's also a fragility to it. Okay? That's the kingdom of the Antichrist to come. It will seem very strong. It'll rule the world, but for a very short time. For a very short time. Okay? Only, for real, only 3.5 years. I mean, 7 years tribulation, yeah, but mainly 3.5 years. Okay? So again, the 10 toes of the feet in Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2 is the same as the 10 horns on the head of this animal or this beast that Daniel didn't know what it was because it's like no other beast. So you get that? Are we good? We know what we're talking about here now? Okay? So, notice here in verse 21. And I was watching, and the same horn, that little horn, was making war against the saints. And particularly, they're speaking of the Jewish people. During the tribulation is what it's speaking of. And if you remember, we went through a study of all of that and looked at it in the book of Revelation. And it says, and he was prevailing against them. You see that? So, it's interesting because the scriptures tell us here that those 10 horns. Was I reading the right thing? I was reading the wrong thing again, wasn't I? I am so thrown off tonight. I just read you verse 21, right? Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. We were in verse 23, correct? Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. My mind is scattered tonight. Yeah, so verse 23. The fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth. That's Rome. And then if you come down to verse 24, that's what I thought I was talking about. It's what I was talking about. I just told you verse 20 or verses 20 and 21. Look at verse 24. Then 10 horns are 10 kings. This is this 10-nation confederacy that is going to rise up out of Europe, out of the old Roman Empire in the future. It says, The 10 horns are 10 kings who shall, notice these words, shall arise from this kingdom. So those 10 horns that represent 10 kingdoms, 10 nations, are going to arise out of another kingdom. What kingdom? The fourth kingdom being mentioned here, which is Rome. Okay? Now the problem is by about what? What we looking at? 500 AD. The Roman Empire was no longer a world dominating force. But here's the thing. It didn't disappear. It's just for all this time now, for the last 1,500 years, it's just laid dormant. Like it's a sleeping giant. It's still there. No other kingdom has come into Europe and just took over the whole thing. It's the continent of Europe made of all these different nations. Well, how interesting is that? Because it tells us that out of that kingdom is going to rise 10 particular nations. You see that? So Rome never really did disappear. It never really did go away. It just kind of lay dormant for the last 1,500 years. Okay? So, it says that the 10 horns are 10 kings who shall arise from this kingdom, talking about the 10-nation confederacy that will rise out of the old Roman Empire. And then what's it say? And another shall rise after them. And notice what it says. He. See? Though it says, and another shall rise after them, speaking of another kingdom, now it turns to the leader or the ruler of that kingdom. He shall be different from the first ones. And look what it says. Just as the dream that God gave to Daniel, or the vision God gave to Daniel said, he shall subdue 3 kings. So you got 10 nations coming in the future in Europe, in the old Roman Empire, going to raise up. They're going to come together as a coalition of nations. And then the Antichrist is going to rise up out of those. And then he is going to subdue or dominate 3 of those nations. So you have 10. Then you have the Antichrist, which makes 11. He's going to subdue 3, which is going to leave you here with 8. You see how this works? Okay, now, if you keep reading, it's going to describe and give us more characteristics of the Antichrist and his conduct, which we have already looked at. And notice it starts with, he shall speak pompous words against the Most High and persecute the saints of the Most High. It's speaking of how he's going to blaspheme God and persecute the Jewish people. Okay? So, where's the Antichrist going to come? The 10 horns are 10 kings who shall rise from this kingdom. The 10 horns correspond with the 10 toes in the statue of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, which represent the coming kingdom of the Antichrist, which will be a revived Roman Empire consisting of a 10-nation confederacy ruling with the Antichrist. They will rule with him. How do we know? Revelation chapter 17. In verse 12, here's what it says. It says, the 10 horns which you saw. Now, it's not referring to the 10 horns that Daniel saw here. When it's speaking of the 10 horns that you saw in chapter 17 of Revelation, what did John see? He saw a beast, okay, who was being ridden by a woman. He saw a scarlet beast being ridden by a woman. The woman speaks of the one world religion that's coming, okay, that rides on the back of the beast, that rides on the back of the power of the Antichrist. In John's vision in chapter 17, he sees that scarlet beast with 10 horns. Okay? That's what it's talking about in Revelation 17. But the imagery is the same, isn't it? Isn't it interesting? That as God gave this to Daniel in his vision, he gave it to him as 10 horns. And the Antichrist was the little horn that would come out from them. Well, that was the same imagery that Jesus gave to John about the same thing. And it says, the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings. So the verbiage is the same. 10 kings who have received no kingdom as of yet, as of the time Jesus was giving the vision to John, but they receive authority for 1 hour, for a very short time, as kings, what's it say? With the beast. Who's the beast? The Antichrist. So do you see the continuity between Daniel's vision and the interpretation of it and John's vision that Jesus gives him of the revelation? Yes, this is how we look at the biblical consistency and we can be sure that this is what this is. Okay? So, it's important to understand when we look at this that the Bible is being very clear to us about what's going to happen. And so it's important here when we read in verse 24, and another shall rise after them. He shall be different than the first ones and shall subdue 3 kings. This is the Antichrist. Okay? Now go back to chapter 8. And I'll shove in as fast as I can what I can. Because I know you're all just dying to eat some cake. Right? Okay. Now, next Wednesday, what we'll do is we will pick up where we leave off tonight and just move forward. Okay? I'm not going to review next week like I did tonight. We just haven't really hammered this down for a while, so I wanted to make sure we understood what we're talking about. Now, in chapter 8, verse 23, look what it says. A king shall arise. Future fulfillment, who's going to arise? The Antichrist. Where is he going to rise from? The revived Roman Empire. He's going to rise from a 10-nation confederation, okay, that will be a revived Roman Empire in the future. And look what it says about him. Let's start getting in now into the description of the Antichrist. Here is his conduct, or his character and his conduct. It says, number 1, here's the first description we have of him. Having fierce features. You see that? Having fierce features. I mean, when you hear those words, what emotion should it strike in you? If he's got fierce features, it should be fear. It should be like, awe and fear. Well, what's interesting is the word fierce here in Hebrew means strong, powerful, firm. It also means violent, hard, and bold. That's what it means. The word fierce. The word features in Hebrew is the word panim. Panim means faces. Okay? It's the word for face. And so when you put it together, fierce features in Hebrew means strong or of bold face. Strong of face or bold of face. Okay? Now, other translations translate it this way. Some say that he's a king of fierce countenance. He's fierce looking. He has a bold face. And then some translate it this way. Ruthless, insolent, and rash. Well, which one of those is right? They all are. They're all right. I don't want to say they're all right, but they're all correct. Okay? And so, this is a man who's going to have a fierce countenance. He's fierce looking. He has a bold face, strong of face, which means he's not afraid. He's very confident of himself, very arrogant. But he's also ruthless, he's insolent, he's rash. Okay? So, if we go to the New Testament now, we should see this. We see the description of the Antichrist that fits this. Okay? So what I want you to do, turn with me to Revelation chapter 6. Revelation chapter 6. So here comes a man who has an appearance that people are in awe of, but they're also afraid of. He's a man who, in his appearance and his countenance, is confident. So because of that, to the masses, he's appealing. But he also is a very violent and ruthless person. But at the beginning of the tribulation, the world doesn't see that part of him. All they see in his bold face, in his strong face, is a man who's got confidence and a man that looks like he can be trusted to help us in a horrible time, and the horrible time the world will be going through at that time. Okay? So Revelation chapter 6, after the church has been raptured, sometime after that, how long, we don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. We don't know how long it will be after the church is raptured until the tribulation begins. But we know this, the tribulation begins in Revelation chapter 6, verse 1, when Jesus takes the scroll, the title deed to the earth, from the hand of God the Father. It's in his right hand. He takes it from him, and he begins to open the seals. There's 7 seals on the scroll. He opens those seals. As every seal is opened and the scroll is opened further and further, every seal that's opened, a judgment is poured out upon the earth. Okay? So we don't know how long it will be between the rapture and the tribulation, which begins here in Revelation 6:1. But I don't believe that it'll be very long, because can you imagine the chaos that will be going on in the world when the church is gone from the earth instantly? In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, all of a sudden, all true born-again believers are missing off the face of the earth. Can you imagine? This earth is going to be rocking and reeling in a way that we just can't even imagine. So what's that going to call for? Well, that's going to call for somebody to step on the world stage and try to bring peace to a crazy, chaotic world and calm everybody down and give them some hope. Well, look at chapter 6, verse 1. Now I saw when the Lamb, that's Jesus, opened one of the seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures saying with a voice like thunder, "Come and see." And I looked, and behold, a white horse. Oh, good guys ride on the white horses, right? You've all seen Westerns. It's always a good guy on the white horse. Now there is a white horse coming later in Revelation 19, and that will be the true Messiah, Jesus Christ, when he returns to the earth the second time. Don't be fooled, though. This white horse is not Jesus Christ. And here's how we know. When Jesus comes, he's going to bring peace. After he judges and makes war, he's going to establish his kingdom and bring peace. Well, what happens here is the guy on this horse promises peace, but his ulterior motive is to conquer the world, to rule it. And when you look at the subsequent judgments and seals that are broken after that, what happens? Peace is taken from the world, and it's nothing but absolute chaos. Okay? So there's many ways that we know that the rider on the white horse in verse 2 here is not Jesus Christ. But instead, it's the Antichrist. It's the one who comes instead of Christ, presenting himself as a false Christ with a false peace. No, I should say it this way. He presents himself as the true Christ, but he's a false Christ bringing a false peace. So look what it says. There he is on a white horse. He's a good guy, right? No. He who sat on it had a bow, but notice he's got no arrow. But what's a bow going to do you any good without an arrow? Nothing. What's that imagery? He's giving the perception that he's coming in peace to the world. So he has a bow, he has no arrow, and a crown was given to him. So his authority doesn't come from himself. This crown was given to him. Someone crowned him. Okay? And so we will see that ultimately his power is from God. God is allowing him to do what he's doing. We'll also see in Revelation 13 his power comes from Satan. And we also see later in the book of Revelation that what's going to happen is the kings of the earth will give their authority and their sovereignty to him. Boy, does that sound familiar? Yeah. You know, America is being pressured to give up our sovereignty, to become part of a one world government. You know, you got the World Health Organization that is wanting the sovereignty of every nation for the safety of everybody, just in case there's another pandemic. You know, America's sovereignty is being threatened, and the sovereignty of every country in the world is being threatened. And how are they being threatened? By globalists saying, you know what? It's no good that we're divided and we have borders. We need to become one so we can bring peace to the world. Okay? That's the whole point and bottom line of the UN. Is what? Peace and security. Well, we can only do it as we all become one. That is all Antichrist thinking. That's not what brings peace. God is the one who established nations. He's also the one who established the borders of those nations. Okay? It's a good thing. This is different nations with different tribes, tongues, and peoples. That was God's idea. This whole idea of let's all just, you know, become one together and sing kumbaya and bring peace to the world, that is a pseudo-peace. That's not how it's done. Okay? I think mankind's proven that through history. So, anyway, let me end with this one because we're running out of time. So we'll just have to pick up here and move on next week. But it tells us here that the crown was given to him, and he went out. What did he go out doing? Conquering and to conquer. Do you see that? I think I have it up here. Did I tell you to turn there? I told you to turn there, didn't I? Boy, I tell you, I am just out of sorts tonight. Man, oh man. I have it up there for you. So notice what's going on here with the Antichrist. He's a man who has fierce features. When he comes on the scene riding a white horse, which means he's a good guy, he's a peaceful guy. He has a bow and no arrows, which means he comes in peace. He's going to arise at a time when there's just going to be absolute apostasy and decadence and chaos in the world. And he's going to arise up and look like he is just the guy for the job to take care of all the problems of the world. You see that? But notice, a crown was given to him. Nations and people will look at him and they will crown him and they will honor him and they will give, nations and kings will give their authority to him. He's the guy we need to follow. But what is his agenda? Look at the last part of the verse. He comes to what? Comes out conquering and to conquer. Do you see that? So he comes as a very deceitful person in the very beginning. Okay? So we're going to stop right there because from there I've got, well, right off the bat, I got 3 scriptures. One for us to go to and 2 more to give you to talk more about his fierce features from the New Testament. Okay? So we're going to stop right there. And we'll pick up right there next week. Okay? So next week, be ready. Daniel chapter 8, verse 23. We're going to pick it up right there. And we're just going to get straight into this. All right? And talk about the characteristics of the Antichrist. So we got a good start. At least you know now when he comes on the scene, he comes as a man of peace. So one part of his face is attractive to people. Oh, he's a peaceful guy. But there's another part of his face that he's like, no, I'm here to conquer. I'm here to take over, which is a very fierce face. So we could say this. This would be correct to say. The Antichrist will be the ultimate two-face. He will. Okay? So people who are living at the time will need to beware And so this is all just more reason why, right now, if people aren't saved, they need to get saved to make sure their hearts are right. Because if they're not and the rapture happens, they're going to be thrown into this chaos and into this horrible, horrible time like the world's never seen before. And they're going to have to face this guy, and they're going to see him, and he will be very convincing. And those who follow him, and eventually, in the second half of the tribulation, those who worship his image and take the number of his name in order to buy and sell and to survive, will be doomed to the lake of fire. So, this is another reason why prophecy is so important to us. We may look at this and go, well, this is all in the future. What's this got to do with me? It's got everything to do with you. It's got everything to do with you. Because what it should do is cause in you a desire to want to live a holy life, a desire to want to get close to the Lord, a desire to want to make sure your heart is right with God, and then when Jesus comes to rapture the church, you're not out there playing spiritual tiddlywinks and left behind to go through all this. See? So it's very important. But also, prophecy, it shouldn't only give us a concern for ourselves and our own spiritual temperature with God. It also should give us a desire to share the gospel with people who, if they don't repent and put their faith in Christ, they are going to go through this, if we're that generation that sees the rapture.